Right.
So this is on? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, once again, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce and to welcome Natali Reyd at our university. And it's a rare chance to meet Natali Reyd, who is an expert in academic teaching and who has been teaching for the past 20 years academic writing throughout Europe, Japan, the Pacific and the US. And she is a world-renowned personality in the field, and it's a real luck that we are having Natali today at our university. And I'd like to start with some thanks to the Russian Council for International Affairs, who has arranged all this, and the representative of this council is present here, and it's thanks to Ekaterina Cheremis that we managed to actually arrange this event. Would also like to thank the organizers of this event at this university, Irina Kuzmicheva, my assistant, and all of you, all the departments who have been so responsive and who have delegated so many participants of this course. So Natali Reyd, as I said, is a well-reputed expert in the field, but she is currently teaching academic writing at University of Berkeley, California at Berkeley, and you know, it rings the bell for everybody. 32 or 40 Nobel Prize winners at University of Berkeley, something like this.
Oh, they probably over 100. They compete with Stanford for who has more.
Already, when I was there, it was 35, but it was some time ago already.
I think they keep, yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
they keep competing.
Anyway, everybody knows what Berkeley is. And by the way, we are cooperating closely with Berkeley University. We have Professor Petrova, who is supposed to be here, and we send on a regular basis our students to summer school to Berkeley, University of Berkeley, and the students from Berkeley are coming here for summer school of Russian. So, Natali Reyd is the author of 4 books on American English language and culture, including Dictionary of English Phrasal Usage. In addition to having taught English as a second language in the International Studies Department of the University of California, Berkeley, she has also designed and taught language training workshops for native speakers of English in both the public and private sectors. And of course, since the early 30s, she has been teaching what I already said, academic writing, and one of her latest publications, which will be used today, is Getting Published in International Journals, Writing Strategies for European Social Scientists. And it was published in Oslo, and this is the book which will be used today. And we just discussed with Natali the possibility of publishing these books in Russia. An English book published in Russia, because that's exactly what we need at the moment. Young scholars, not only young scholars, need to be published in international journals. And this book is a clue to your success. Sorry, I sound too much, maybe like an advertising agent, but I'm so excited at this possibility. And once again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Natali at our university. And I'm now giving the floor to Natali. If you don't need us here, we can move away, because maybe we'll be interfering.
No, nobody's interfering. It's fine. I can talk with people sitting on my lap. My mother could never shut me up, so it's not a problem. But when it's time for a break, somebody has to tell me, because I can just keep talking and talking and talking. So when it's break time, someone has to remind me. Okay? I usually speak without notes, but I put the lecture together today because this book is based on 6.5 days of teaching, and I had to cut out 20,000 words to meet the 300-page limit, and I've only got a few hours because I have to leave time for questions to take 6.5 days of teaching into this short lecture. So I wanted to make sure I had everything exactly where I want it so that I hit the main points. So first of all, I'm both delighted and honored to be here today to speak to you about academic writing in English what it entails, what it demands, and I mean demands, and both why and how it differs from academic writing in Russian. I'm particularly happy to be speaking here at the University for the Humanities, because even though for the past 9 years in particular, I've been working only with social scientists in 6 European countries, my background is in the humanities, in history and linguistics, and that's where my heart is. So thank you for the privilege of being here. In addition, because I'm not only an instructor of courses on English academic writing and journal analysis, but also an editor of and consultant on English papers by non-native speakers of English, I'll also discuss the editing process and the submission process, including the Anglo-American and European process of anonymous peer review. And it's my understanding that that's not what goes on in Russia. So I'll conclude with some comments on what it's been like to work with Russian scholars for the first time and to edit their papers, and then I'll take questions. Is that agreeable? So if you don't mind holding the questions till the end, I'll try to move through this as quickly as possible to hit all the main points. If I speak too fast, somebody has to yell, "Natalie, slow down," and I will. But you have to do that. So I'm American, I'm Natalie, I'm not Ms. Anybody, and that's what I answer to.
Natalie, I'm sorry,
Yes.
I'm trying to yield. Are we going to have a break after an hour and a half?
Yes, so I said someone has to tell me, Natalie, it's break time, because I won't remember, okay?
Right, so shall we say in an hour and a half? Right, okay.
An hour and a half, okay,
Yes, thank you.
good. So my job is to get European and now Russian students and scholars published in professional English journals. I ground this highly pragmatic work in the linguistic theory of contrastive rhetoric, which is the idea that the approaches to both reading and writing in different linguistic communities set up very different sets of expectations among their readers. Each community tends to believe that its way is reasonable and logical, and that everyone else's is strange, inferior, or both. One American prejudice, for example, is that European and Russian scholars theorize too much and are very sloppy in the way they present their data and their conclusions. One European prejudice, for example, is that we Americans lack intellectual curiosity and we are too positivistic and too simplistic in our thinking. Both of these prejudices and many others come out of assuming that the way one does things in one's own linguistic community is the right way and therefore the only way to do those things. And neither group is right or wrong, because this is not about being right or wrong, this is simply about the truth that there are differences. However, given that English, for better or worse, is the lingua franca, the language of commerce in the international academic community, and given that there's a real push in Russia now for Russian scholars to publish in English, then the more you know about the unconscious expectations of English-speaking readers, the better you'll be able to reach them and to have them think well of your work. But before I start with the content itself, I have several yes or no questions that I'd like to ask all of you, and would like you to simply raise your hand if the question is yes. So first, have you ever spent time for work or school or pleasure outside of the Russian Federation? May I see hands? Now everybody look around and see how many hands are going up. High, so everyone can see? Okay. Next question. Have you ever spent at least 1 month outside of the Russian Federation? Not traveling around, but in one country specifically. Okay, still a good number of hands. Have you ever spent at least 3 months outside of Russia in one country? Okay, but you notice the hands are getting a little smaller fewer every time. And for those of you who have spent time in a particular country or region outside of the Russian Federation, did you find that the other country's social culture called for you to act differently than you do in Russia? Aha. And did you adapt to that culture so you could fit in better? Aha. All right. So, what I liked about looking at the number of hands is that almost everyone who spent time outside also raised his or her hand for, yes, I adapted, which is important because what I've discovered in my years of teaching is that anyone who ever traveled to another country for business, education, or pleasure immediately notices cultural differences. Yet few people notice that writing and what the rhetorical conventions of a particular language or country expect from its writers also differ greatly from country to country. And so for the rest of this lecture, when I speak of cultural differences and I speak of culture, I will be referring specifically to differences in the linguistic culture, in the ways that people of a specific language tend to expect their speakers to organize their presentations and their writers to organize and present their ideas. There is no right or wrong involved here, as I said earlier, but only differences, and it is these specific differences that I'm here to discuss. In brief, for writing in general, but for academic writing in particular, English makes unusual demands of the writer. And out of this recognition came the theory that I mentioned previously, the theory of contrastive rhetoric. Contrastive rhetoric developed in the United States in the mid-20th century within the area of applied linguistics known as teaching English as a second language, commonly known as ESL. ESL teachers noticed that their foreign students had difficulty organizing their thinking or presenting their ideas according to English writing norms. Moreover, the more difficulties the students had, and the harder they tried to please their teachers, the more they resorted to the strategies from their first language, and the worse their writing in English became. Ultimately, teachers and theorists within ESL and the wider field of applied linguistics realized that each linguistic community has its own culturally determined conventions for and approaches to writing. These differences range from what an introduction needs to contain to whether papers should have conclusions, discussions, both or none at all. They range from what voice, active or passive, the culture gives most intellectual weight to, or whether an author may cite his or her own research or use the word I to take credit for a new theory or method. They also range from whether the writer should be completely explicit about everything to give the reader all the information, or whether the writer should assume a lot of common knowledge on the part of the reader and therefore give the reader very little. These examples barely scratch the surface. Overall, academic writing is full of unwritten cultural and rhetorical rules, and because they're unwritten, you are unlikely to have learned them in school. So I see my job as basically leveling the playing field so that non-native speakers can learn the unwritten rules that all native speakers know and therefore have a better chance at competing for limited space in publication in the top international journals. But it's going to take a lot of work. And my experience with the Russian scholars whom I taught in November and whose papers I've been editing tells me that there's a lot of work to be done in teaching what these unwritten rules are. So I'm going to get going. The more you learn about these rules, the better your chances of being published. In addition, while most non-native speakers of English are aware that British English and American English or Canadian English are a little bit different, and that they differ not just in spelling, but also vocabulary, punctuation, grammar, few scholars realize that learning and applying these differences is not optional, it's mandatory. Native speakers of English say, for example, American English, UK English, as two separate languages. And the journals are very specific. The journal might say, we prefer US English, but we will take UK English, but we will not take a mix. And in 9 years of teaching European scholars, I have yet to see one that didn't mix and match US and UK English because they don't know the difference. To us, they are two different languages. You have to know the difference. And I've been corresponding with, I haven't met, a woman in the UK who runs a business translating American English into British English for publication in the UK and vice versa. Okay? Business, not just academic work, but business work, because the words are different. And the words can get you in trouble if you use the wrong ones. So, this compulsory nature of the Anglo-American rhetorical tradition, that is, what the writer must do and has no choice, but must do, constitutes one of the core points of this lecture. Basically, no matter what your subject is or your topic of your research or your theorizing, your paper must be sufficiently clear, concise, as tight as possible, focused, and stylistically appropriate for an international journal to accept it. A style that works well for oral presentations with inflections, with jokes, with irony, with sarcasm. The kind of talk that I'm giving now or you might give at a meeting always needs rewriting if you want to get it published, because none of that face-to-face communication is present. Basically, the key to good writing in English is clarity of prose, and prose means language, and clarity of focus, that is, clarity of organization according to very strict Anglo-American norms that I will discuss later in the lecture. And because the key to getting published is clarity of prose and clarity of focus, the right combination of coherence and composition will greatly increase your chances of having your articles published. It is also critical for you to first analyze the organization and linguistic style of papers already published in the journal you have chosen, so that your paper looks like it has already been published in the journal before you submit it. Down to the vocabulary they use, the length of paragraph, the style of sentences, the organization. Does method come in front of theory? Does theory come in front of method? How do they do it in that journal? And I once had a young student. She, in fact, was not even a PhD student yet. She'd just gotten her master's degree. And she was competing for a Young Scholars Prize in a very prestigious political science journal. And we were working on the paper. She was German, working in Denmark. Her language skills were fabulous. And I was looking through the journal, and she had very carefully shown the theory and how her method developed out of the theory. And I said to her, you know, in this journal, they always put the method before they put the theory. And she said, but that doesn't make sense because blah, blah, blah. I said, shh, shh. Do you want to be right or do you want to get published? And she changed it, rewrote it, she got published. You don't get the option to tell the editor what to do. You find out what the editor likes and you give the editor what the editor wants, down to the word, the grammar, the style. This is called journal analysis. Very few people teach it. I have a section in the book on it, and I'll be talking about it later today. Unfortunately, many European and Russian academics erroneously believe that adjusting their style for the English-speaking market would somehow diminish or erase the scholarly quality of their writing because the straightforwardness of the English style doesn't fit the style they're accustomed to writing in. Good English writing hates the passive voice. We write in the active voice so that the reader is always clear who is doing what. I can't tell you in how many of the Russian papers I'm writing back to these very fine scholars, some of whom are, professors in top universities in Moscow, and saying, I can't tell from this sentence, did the Russians do this to the Georgians, or did the Georgians do this to the Russians? Put it in the active voice and let me know. So if I had to give Russian scholars one piece of advice and none other for succeeding in English, it's because of the difference between Russian grammar and the way you can move words around in Russian and put any word you want at the beginning of a sentence almost, which you cannot do in English, and just change the endings to make it work. If you end up writing in the passive voice in Russian syntax in English, nobody will understand a word. So if you write in English, write only in the active voice, who did what, not something was done, you have a better chance of succeeding right from the start. Get rid of the passive voice, throw it out. If my lecture was only this, you would have learned enough. Okay. To compound the problem, I think most courses in academic English writing, if there are any here, I don't know, focus on writing in an inaccessible academic style that has nothing to do with what real academics do in English when they write and speak to one another. For example, those few American academics who have won the Pulitzer Prize in their fields, such as Leon Litwack, with Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, winner of a number of American prizes. These academics have won the Pulitzer precisely because they don't write in a, quote, academic style. Instead, their focused and fluid language makes their rigorous scholarship accessible to both academics and non-academics alike. And that's what makes them great writers. So, the three main subjects of this lecture, therefore, are major readability problems in academic writing. What gets in the way of the readers accessing the material? Passive voice, overly long sentences, overly long paragraphs, poor organization, for example. Second, the indefensibility of a style that forces readers to struggle with the reading process. And what I'll say just in brief, but it's very important, is that in English, when you write, nobody cares about you. Forget it. You don't count. The only person who counts in English is the reader. And you do everything you can to make the reading easy for the reader, because that is what we are taught. The writer's job is to do everything, and the reader's job is to just read. It's a very different style. And even all of us who go to university and we learn to write long sentences and show off our big vocabulary to show our professors how smart and clever we are, if we want to get published, we have to unlearn all of that and write for the reader. So just remember that. You don't count. I don't count. Only the reader counts in English. And remember that. We do everything we can to give the reader everything the reader needs, and what the reader needs I'm coming to later. And so the last part, of course, is what constitutes good academic writing in English and how you can achieve it. But before we can even begin to start about talking about academic writing, we need to understand the way that people read, what I call the psychology of reading. Only when we understand the way people read can we write to them in the most effective way possible. The problem is that people in different cultures have different psychologies of reading. And the reason is that along with every language comes a linguistic culture, a way not only of speaking and reading and writing, but also of thinking about, organizing, and presenting information. So, for example, with my Russian scholars with whom I worked, they were having trouble understanding what I was discussing about territory and niche, and I'll get to that later. And one of them said, well, let me explain what we do in Russian, and maybe that will help you. I said, okay. He said, when I write in Russian, there is this big subject, and in the middle of the subject, there is an object. And I start my paper by thinking about how I'm going to approach that object. And I said to everyone else in the course, is that right? And they said, yeah, that makes sense. And you know, when you're teaching, those of you who teach or will be teaching, you don't have 10 minutes to think about it. You have to answer on the spot. I said, so you want my well-considered opinion about this idea of writing? They said, yeah. I said, not in English, you don't. That's it. Forget it. That might work in Russian. It's not going to work in English. We do something totally different, and we went on to discuss it, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes. So every linguistic culture has a different way of thinking about the world. Every language, in my view, a language is a way of apprehending and understanding the world. And the more languages you know, the more you realize that people in different cultures understand the world differently because their languages work differently. I live in New Mexico. I live in what we call Indian country. Do you know that in most of the Native American languages, there are no nouns? Everything is like an ing verb. Everything is constantly in motion. And in fact, Hopi is a fabulous language for quantum mechanics because of the way everything is constantly in motion, just like waves and particles. Okay? Try to speak Russian without a noun. Think about it. Try to speak English without a noun. You can't do it. Not any of the Indo-European languages. But in Native American languages, there are no nouns. They're not relevant. Time is different. Everything is different. So, while English may differ greatly from the UK to New Zealand to Australia to the US and so on, there nonetheless exists a linguistic culture among all native speakers of English. And within this culture, speakers have a very specific organizational framework, a way of approaching and apprehending the world, and a way of analyzing and presenting what they find in it. So every linguistic community has its own culture, and people in the culture believe that the way they do it is logical. So today when I speak of the logic of English, I don't expect you to think of it as logical, as Russian speakers. Nonetheless, if you're going to write in English, you have to immerse yourself in that logic if you are going to succeed. So to paraphrase an English saying, and I'm sure you have something like it in Russian, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So when writing in English, think like a Brit or an American. If you try thinking like a Russian, you will fail. And I'm telling you that right now. And I tell everybody that everywhere I teach. If you're going to succeed in writing in another language, you have to expand. You don't give up being Russian. You expand your understanding of who you are and what it means to write academically so that you take on an additional persona. You don't give up the one you have, but you add one and your repertoire just simply becomes bigger. So, what does it mean, the logic of the English linguistic community? To answer this question, I turn to the field of contrastive rhetoric, which is the study of cross-cultural differences in writing. differences in rhetorical approach, differences in organization, differences in emphasis, and above all, and most important for you, differences in the obligations of readers and writers. While we can define rhetoric itself as the way we put language together to affect an audience, each audience has different expectations of rhetoric and rhetorical structure based on the traditional forms in their own culture and language. So Finnish researcher Ulla Connor, in her classic book, Contrastive Rhetoric, writes the following, and I quote, "Contrastive rhetoric is an area of research in second language acquisition that identifies problems in composition encountered by second language writers and, by referring to the rhetorical strategies of the first language, attempt to explain them. Contrastive rhetoric maintains that language and writing are cultural phenomena. As a direct consequence, each language has rhetorical conventions unique to it." And here's the important sentence for you. "Furthermore, the linguistic and rhetorical conventions of the first language interfere with writing in the second language." In other words, to quote a psychologist friend of mine, if you're dancing with someone and stepping on his or her feet, you're doing the wrong dance, and dancing faster won't help. You have to learn to dance differently. Meeting the rhetorical expectations of another culture requires more than attention to language. The cultural expectations of the new audience may mean that the writer needs to rearrange the information, use different kinds of examples, introduce those examples differently, and so on. The writer has to make these changes to create the appropriate contexts for readers to absorb and understand what they are saying, because readers in different cultures have different expectations from writers. And the writer may have to use highly structured rhetorical devices to avoid ambiguity or misunderstanding. One of the greatest sins in English is to be ambiguous. If you are not clear, the reader will go into what Americans call mego reading. Mego, all in capitals, M-E-G-O, stands for "my eyes glazed over." And once the reader's eyes glaze over, the reader puts it down and says, "I'll come back to it later." And the reader never does. So you cannot afford in English to be unclear or ambiguous for one word. If you are, you will lose your reader, and your reader will never come back. And if the reader is an editor or the reader is a reviewer, there go your chances of being published. When I said English is demanding, I mean it. And I have tremendous respect for all of you, that you speak English, that you can work in English, that you're thinking of writing in English, and I have tremendous compassion for all of you because of the huge demands that English makes. I also know of the huge demands that Russian makes, and I know that if I wanted to write in Russian, God help me, but English is just as bad. It's just different. So, I do not presuppose to know the rhetorical conventions of Russian, although the Russian scholars with whom I work have taught me some of them. But I do know the rhetorical conventions of English, and especially academic English. So again, I reiterate that what I'm about to tell you is not something that I believe is right or wrong. I'm a pragmatist. It simply is, and if you want to succeed in English, you've got to follow these unwritten conventions, whether you like them, agree with them, or not. So, what are they? The most important principle in English rhetoric is that the writer has to do all of the work, so that the reader is essentially spoon-fed the information the way you would feed a baby. The writer is to frame, which means it's an American verb to frame. It means to put a frame around or to contextualize everything. Frame the entire paper, frame every section, frame every paragraph, so that the reader doesn't have to think while reading as much as absorb the information, which is 100% clear, and then think about what he or she thinks about what he or she just read. In other words, English is a completely writer-responsible language, and as far as I know, it is the only one in the world. And unfortunately, it's the world language now, and you're stuck with it. So please don't shoot the messenger. This approach, of course, is not true for many cultures. In China, for example, a student is largely a commentator on the classics and on the scholarship of others. So he or she writes to pass on what he or she has received. You notice I'm using he or she a lot. The Russian sexist he will not work. Sexist language is not allowed in English. Get rid of it now. Or using she for a country or he for a human being. Get rid of it. Forget it. Don't even think it in English, okay? That went out in the 70s. It's gone. So a good academic writer in Chinese, therefore, will quote from or refer to all the experts in the field, present what they say, add his or her own small, humble contribution, and then stop. That would be the end of the paper. Because to draw a conclusion in Chinese would be to insult the intelligence of the reader, who is expected to do the thinking and concluding himself or herself. In other words, Chinese is a completely reader-responsible language, as is Japanese, as is Korean. Now, most of the European languages, of course, fall in the middle between these two extremes. While the writer, of course, gives her or his own opinions and makes them clear, the reader is expected to participate more actively in the many stories or the many digressions. And the often theoretical digressions are acceptable in part in German and French and Russian because the reader is seen as having more active role to play in following the writer's thinking. Okay? And I want to, well, let me just say one more thing and then I'll get to this. I'll add here from an English-speaking point of view, there's nothing wrong with theory. There's nothing wrong with theorizing. Of course we theorize. But in English, the writer has to introduce and present the theory in a way that conforms to the expectations of the readership. In other words, you can't take Foucault or Bourdieu and simply plop them down in the middle of a paragraph about something else with no introduction as to why they're in this paragraph, why the theory is relevant here in the paper and not 3 pages earlier, what's the point of having it here, why the reader needs to know about it now. And so the simplest way of explaining this, if I'm going to use visual aids, which is my hand. There was an American linguist, I think it was Robert Kaplan, anyway, his name was Kaplan, somewhere in the mid-20th century, who came up with symbolic notations for a number of languages. And Russian was one and English was one, so it's kind of interesting. And the way in which their rhetorical systems work. So for example, in the Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, you would, if you watch my hand, you start discussing the topic, and then you go to 0 degrees. Then you go to 180, then to 0, then to 180, then to 0, then to 180, and conclude. You're either for or against. There is no middle, there is no gray area, there is only black and white. Okay? That's the way you argue in Arabic. Okay, and I lived in the Middle East for a while where people shout their opinions at each other and nobody can find a middle ground because there is no middle. That's not how the rhetorical system works. And that's why culture is constantly influencing language, and language is constantly influencing culture. Now, in Chinese, Korean, Japanese, to just start with the main point is barbaric, and it's uncivilized and very unsophisticated. So instead, you do this. You circle around carefully to get to the main topic. You don't just go to it. Now, in the Romance languages like French, Italian, Portuguese, or Spanish, you begin a subject, and then you take a digression over to here. And then you come back, and your reader kind of waits, and then you talk about the subject, take another little digression, then you come back, and so on. According to Kaplan, in Russian, it's a little more extreme. You start like this, you take a digression way out to there, and then you come back, and then you come here, and then you take a digression way out to there, and then you come back. And when I'm in other countries, I say, think about the brothers Karamazov and the Grand Inquisitor in the middle of the novel, and that, I remember reading it, of course, in English as a young teenager and thinking, what's this book doing in the middle of the book? What happened to the brothers? What happened to the story? Because to me, it was this huge interruption. It was a very interesting one. I think the Grand Inquisitor is fabulous. But why was it there? Why didn't anyone tell me it was coming? What's it doing there? Why? And of course, a Russian will just hang with it. So, what do you think the English looks like? Anybody have any idea? You're right, I saw that. It's an arrow straight down. No looking to the left, no looking to the right, because in English, we are not narrating data, or we are not discussing a theory, or we are not describing a situation. We are creating a proof, a mathematical proof, and everything must be organized and framed in a way that it's aimed at that target. Because if you have a bow and arrow and you're aiming at a target, you don't want to wobble from side to side because you'll never hit the target. And there are writers in English who actually write their conclusions first, because after their research and their thinking, they know what their conclusions are, and then they go back and they organize the paper so that the paper perfectly leads to those conclusions. It's not a bad strategy. Some people don't think that way, they don't write that way, but some people do. If your mind can do that, it's an excellent strategy. It really works. So English demands that you create a proof exactly like a mathematical one. In mathematics, you can't leave any steps out. You can't leave any equations out. You can't leave any numbers out. Everything has to be in the right place to create a proof. At the end, you can put QED. And can someone tell me what QED stands for? Anybody know the Latin? Okay, QED? Yes? No? Quod erat demonstrandum, thus it is being proved. And when you write a paper in English, whether it's about literature, linguistics, archaeology, political science, communications, arts, drama, at the end, you don't put it, but you should be able to put QED, thus I have proved my point. That's the difference in English. So we have English. Let me explain how this came about. We have English above all as the world's only 100% writer-responsible language. And ironically, the purpose of English rhetoric used to be to sway the emotions of an audience. Like Mark Antony and Julius Caesar saying, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, I've come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." And of course, at the end of the speech, they want to all go out and kill the murderers because he swayed their emotions. But language and culture are inextricably connected. You can't separate them. And a little over 200 years ago, in both sides of the English-speaking Atlantic, there was a cultural shift that involved the renewed popularity of Aristotle and Aristotelian thinking based on proofs. So the purpose of rhetoric shifted from persuading people's emotions to convincing their minds, and to doing so with Aristotelian empirical logic. Both speakers and writers now had to not only prove their point, but to show the reader that they had proved it and how they had proved it. So a good English paper is one where you walk the reader through your thinking. The reader is actually involved in your thinking processes. And the reader sees how you're moving from this idea to that idea to the next idea. Often when I'm editing European papers, not just the Russian papers, but all European papers, I'm making a little note in the margin saying, how did you get from this sentence to that sentence? I don't see how you connected them. I don't see where they have anything to do with each other. Every sentence must follow logically from the next, and the logic must be evident. It cannot be in the writer's head, because the reader does not live in your head. It has to be clear on paper. And if you're not used to writing like this, it takes time and practice to become good at it. We have a saying in the U.S. About writing. Now, we laugh when we say it because it's stupid, but we also know that it's true. And it goes like this. First you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. But it's exactly what we do. In other words, you introduce your paper by letting the reader know in the first few sentences or paragraphs what the paper is going to cover. In other words, a purpose statement saying, this paper analyzes this, examines this, and does whatever, better be no later than the first sentence of your fourth paragraph. If it's any later, the reader doesn't know what the paper is about. The reader is frustrated. The reader will say, screw this, and stop reading. Okay? So you tell them what you're going to tell them. So the reader now has a context to know what frame to put the entire paper in. What's the paper going to do? Then you cover exactly what you said you were going to cover. No more, but no less. Then you conclude by reminding the reader of what you said and pulling together all the minor conclusions into one big, clear conclusion, either by stating a position and showing that you've proved it and how you've proved it, or by pointing the way ahead to future research, or both. So have any of you ever heard, and this is not something we learn as academics. This is something we learn as children. It is built into the way we write. So I have a question. Have any of you ever heard of something American called the 5-paragraph essay? Anybody? The 5-paragraph essay? Did you learn about it here, or did you learn about it while you were in the States? Yourself. Yay! Yay for you. Okay. So the 5-paragraph essay is what we are taught. We're taught to write paragraphs and different kinds of paragraphs. A descriptive paragraph, a comparative paragraph looking for similarities, a contrastive paragraph looking for differences, a technical paragraph, and different kinds of paragraphs. And when then we learn to put them together into an essay, we are taught the 5-paragraph essay. Paragraph 1 is where you name your topic and the position that you are going to take relative to the topic. Paragraph 2 is your first defense of your topic. of your position. Paragraph 3 is your second defense of your position, and paragraph 4 is your third defense, because this is based on classic Greek argumentation. We argue in English according to the Greeks, just as the French argue according to Hegel, okay? And the Italians argue according to Hegel and Cicero, and it has to sound nice in Italian. But so every culture is different. But we had to have 3 because one defense of a position or 2 defenses weren't enough. We had to have 3. And paragraph 5 is where you tell them what you told them. You say, therefore, I have shown that this position is the right position, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we're 12 years old when we're learning this. We're 12 and 13 years old. No one tells us we're learning Aristotelian argumentation. They just tell us this is how you write. So, of course, as we get older, this is how we expect everybody to write. And I'll just make a quick digression here. Notice I'm framing. I'm not making my digression. I'm first telling you that I'm about to make a digression. If you tell your reader that you're going to do that, your reader will say, oh, okay, I need to know this first before I go back to that. But in English, you always tell your reader what you're doing and where you're going so that the reader knows what's going on. Then the reader is happy. Okay? So I grew up in Oakland, California, which is nice because it was across the bay from San Francisco and right next to Berkeley. And when I was 5 years old, my father said, you live 15 minutes from one of the best universities in the world, and this is where you're going. I'm 5. I don't know what a university is. I say, yes, Daddy, whatever. And so that's what I did. They don't have this test anymore, but they used to, that you would go your first week and they had a hospital there and you would get your inoculations and you would get checked for your health and you would sign up for courses. But we had to take a test that we were all terrified of. It was called the Subject A test. Subject A was a euphemism meaning English for dummies. Okay, and this was for native speakers, English for dummies. So the first part of the test was grammar. They would give sentences with a blank word, and then you would have a choice of 4 possibilities to fill in the blank, and the 5th was none of the above. So you couldn't even guess. That took about a half hour. Then we were given a sheet of paper with 5 topics on it. We had to pick one topic, and we were given 1 hour, 45 minutes, or I think it was an hour, to write a 5-paragraph essay. If we made 1 grammatical mistake, if we made 2 punctuation errors, or if our argumentation wasn't clear, they would immediately look at the grammar section. And if the grammar section wasn't good, then you flunked the test and you had to take Subject A. And even if you had the highest possible marks in pre-medicine, in physics, in chemistry, in engineering, if you didn't pass the Subject A course in English composition, freshman composition, you couldn't graduate from Berkeley. Because the reasoning was, if you can't make yourself clear on paper, you don't deserve a university degree. End of discussion. I passed it, but it was such a tense time. I still remember the subject and what I wrote on, and that was a long time ago. Okay? That's how deeply ingrained this way of argumentation is in the culture. So it's not that the American reader or the English reader is stupid, that we need to be spoon-fed everything. It's that we are taught that that's the writer's job, that the reader doesn't have a job. The reader is to enjoy, to think, to analyze, to assess, but the reader should have no difficulty in reading because the writing must be perfect. Okay? So it's not that we are somehow intellectually inferior. It's a very different way of thinking about writing and what makes good writing. Is this clear so far? And is this interesting so far? Okay, good. I don't want to be repeating the obvious. Okay. In academic English, we use sequential patterns to organize and present information. To native English speakers, such ordering is logical, and we typically order facts, ideas, and other information according to one of three categories. One is chronological. Okay, so if you're about to discuss something that happened over a period of years, you can start with 2001 and then go to 2004 and then go to 2007. And in some of the Russian papers, I see that they're talking about 2004, then they go back to 2001, then they jump. I'm going, you can't do that. It has to be in order because the chronology is off. You can't jump back and forth. If you're going to explain something, you give the history starting with what happened first, what happened second, what happened third. Or sometimes there will be a list of countries. And I'm saying, why are the countries in this order? Is there a particular reason they're in the order you gave them? UK, US, Switzerland, France? No. Well, if there's no specific order, we put them in alphabetical order. But there always has to be an order. You can put the big countries first, then you tell the reader you're doing that. But otherwise, everything is automatically in alphabetical order, but there is always an order. Because we're always assuming an order and looking for an order. Okay? So one category would be chronological, one that's called psychological. In other words, it's for mental engagement, okay? This idea leads to that idea, leads to the next idea. Or what we call rhetorical, which is for maximum persuasion, organizing to persuade. This would be in a paper where, excuse me, in a paper where what you are about to say is going to be in direct contradiction to the common thinking in the field. You're taking on the big guns. You're saying that they're wrong and that they should have looked at it another way, and you're expecting an argument back at you. So if you're expecting somebody to very much argue with or disagree with what you are saying, then you have to much more carefully organize your paper to persuade your reader to see it your way. And one of the ways we do this in English is by saying, now, some scholars see it this way. Some scholars argue such and such. And you immediately give the position of the opposition. And then you say, however, they haven't considered these facts, these whatever, and then you politely disagree and show why they are wrong or why your position or your argument is better or why your data set is better or perhaps their method was lacking. Always do it politely because you know Murphy's Law? If anything can go wrong, it will. Well, if you are not polite around somebody's method or use of a method or use of a theory, they will be one of your reviewers. And if you don't treat them politely, God help you when they do the review. Okay? Remember, in English, we don't pick our own reviewers. It's anonymous peer review chosen by the editors. You don't pick your own reviewer. And when I told my Danish and my German and my Swiss colleagues that in Russia they pick their own reviewers and they pay them, they almost fainted. They said, what? How can they have any objectivity? How can they? I said, shh, don't talk to me. That's what I just found out. You know, it's a very, very different world. So, as readers, we construct meaning by making logical connections according to the sequencing of information. And we use inductive and deductive reasoning to find out what is most and least important. We expect the deductive method, a purpose statement telling us what to expect in a given paper, and if it isn't there, we are not happy. Not surprisingly then, of all the known rhetorical structures in the world, whoosh, arrow, English is the most linear, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, each following directly, clearly, precisely, and logically from the other. Logical progression is the key. However, if an English writer wishes to digress or bring in another point, we just do so. We say to the reader, okay, a digression is coming, and here's why it's coming, and here's why it's important. You have to frame everything you do in English as important, because if it isn't important, the reader is not interested. One of the impressions I got, and you can correct me afterwards during the question and answer comment period, the impressions I got talking to the Russian scholars I was teaching is that in Russia you can publish a paper about anything that interests you, and it doesn't necessarily have to contribute to the field in some major way. In English, this is unthinkable. In Europe, this is unthinkable. You have to have what is sometimes called added value. If you are not contributing something new to the literature, and you cannot show that what you are contributing is important to the scholarship of the field, nobody will be interested. That's it. There's no wiggle room. That's it. And I saw a paper once that I worked on, a nice little economics paper, that a man who's a very good researcher and a very good writer sent to the International Labor Relations Review at Cornell. It's a very prestigious economics journal, very difficult to get into. And he got, within 24 hours, he got what is called a desk reject. It wasn't sent out for review, it was immediately rejected right from the editor's desk. And the editor said, "This is a very nice paper. I read it 3 times to make sure about my decision. And what I realize is that if I sent it out for review, and even if the reviewers liked it, I would not publish it because it is about a very small issue and applicable only to 2 or 3 countries with this kind of a labor system, and therefore our reviewers would not find it interesting because they want larger topics with wider applicability. Therefore, I'm returning it to you immediately because it's an excellent paper so that you can send it to a more appropriate journal." It wasn't going to meet the needs of the readership. It's not going to get published. He had something new, but it was too small for that journal. And some of the professors I work with, there's one in Switzerland, she says her students come to her, PhD students, and they say, "Oh, I found a niche, I found a topic, an area that nobody has written about, so I have something I can write about." And she says, "Yes, and is it important? Is it valuable?" And when I teach, the example I give is, I'm sure there must be a reason. I've never seen a paper on why 10-minute-old hard-boiled eggs smell differently from 2-week-old hard-boiled eggs. But does anybody care? So it's not enough that you have something new. It has to have value to everybody in the field. And if it doesn't have value and it isn't new, nobody will publish it in English. And my understanding is that's a little different from the Russian culture. And if I'm wrong, please tell me. But that's what I picked up from my students in the course that I taught last November. So, again, I keep returning over and over to the importance of framing in English academic writing. the use of a sentence at the beginning of your paragraph to tell what the paragraph is about, a sentence at the beginning of a section that tells what the section is about, a sentence or more at the beginning of a paper within the first 3 paragraphs telling what the paper is about. And above all, never, ever, ever mix up facts with conclusions or conclusions with recommendations. These are separate in English, and you must keep them separate. And you never put anything new in a conclusion. No new facts, no new quotations, nothing new goes in the conclusion unless it's a European journal where they happen to do that. But if it's a UK journal or a US journal, they won't do that. And what I'd like you to think of is this. The image I always draw is an upside-down triangle. At the top of the triangle is your introduction. The bulk of that triangle is the body of your paper. Your theory, your method, your data, your ideas, your discussion, your whatever. And your results. That's followed by conclusions. But in English, everything is proceeding downward, so your conclusions come out of the body. And then if you have recommendations, the recommendations can only come out of the conclusions. You can't go off to the side looking at new things. So I always tell the people I work with, you have this gorgeous new quote that you've got in your conclusion, get it back into the body and you can re-quote it in the conclusion. But you can't put a new citation, you can't put anything new in the conclusion. Which leads me to another point while I'm thinking about it, because I'm always afraid that I won't hit some main points. With the Russian papers I've been getting, after 3 or 4 papers came in, I looked at them and I emailed everybody who was in the course, and I said, I'm reading your introduction. Where are your citations? Where are your references? And somebody wrote back and said, oh, we don't put them in unless the paper is going to be accepted. And then we put them in. And I didn't know what to say. I was in such shock. Because your introduction in an English paper will always be top-heavy with citations and references. Every statement you make, I don't know, Europe is an increasingly important economic such and such. And then you have 6 citations afterwards to show that you're not making up this conclusion. You're getting it from the journals you read it in, published papers, and important people, and not just people in your country, but people who are cited in the journal, people who are important. And what you're doing by putting in these references is showing what I'll discuss later, your Aristotelian ethos, your trustworthiness, that you are well read enough in the field that we can trust you to listen to your voice as an equal in the academic community. We would never read a paper that doesn't have citations. And I do have a funny story about one guy in one country, and his name and the country shall remain nameless. And he gets published in his own country all the time, and he never, ever, ever gets published in English. Partly his English is really bad, but he could have someone edit it. But the only person he ever cites is himself and his own papers. Of course he'll never get published. Some journals will allow you to cite a previously published paper of yours. Some journals will not. You have to study your journal very carefully and follow what they do. So please pay attention. Use your references. You cannot make a statement in English that is a conclusion without a reference to show where you got it from. And people's introductions are top-heavy with these citations, you don't have as many when you get into the body, because the introduction is where you're proving that you have the right to have a voice in the academic community, that you are learned, that you are well read, and so on and so forth. Okay. In the field of contrastive rhetoric, there is an area called genre analysis. And I'm assuming you all know what a genre is, but a genre is a type of writing. Science fiction is a genre, romance is a genre, creative nonfiction is a genre, science fiction, mysteries is a genre, and there are subgenres within them. In mysteries there are thrillers, and then there are cozies, and so on and so forth. Academic writing is its own genre, and a number of researchers have identified various patterns in academic writing. And the most common pattern in research papers is a three-part one that was identified by an American linguist named John Swales, and he called it CARS in capitals. It's very easy to remember, capital C, capital A, capital R, capital S. And it stands for creating a research space. How do you create a research space? How do you carve out a place for your new idea, your new method, your new approach to the writing of Virginia Woolf, your analysis of these pottery shards or whatever you're working on? And it's three parts, and it goes like this. First, establish a territory. Second, establish a niche inside that territory. Third, occupy that niche with a purpose statement. And I always think of it visually as a bird. This is my branch, this is my nest, and I'm occupying the nest, and no other bird better try to get in here. The problem that I found working with Russian scholars is that this concept of territory was really foreign and really difficult for them to grasp. And the way I think about it is this, that Russia is a gigantic country. It's huge, it's vast. And when I see the papers they write and the way they write, everything is vast and big and cosmic, and the theories are wide, and there are no details, only huge, sweeping statements, which of course is the opposite of what we do in English, totally the opposite. So when we say a territory, we mean this. Here is the field of linguistics. Okay, it's a huge field. American scholars, British scholars, European scholars are not generalists. We don't want to read generalists because we have read generally. We are our own generalists. We want to hear from specialists about specific things. And that's all we're interested in. If you're writing as a generalist, forget getting published in the field. Go publish for a popular magazine like Psychology Today or National Geographic, but you're not going to get published in a professional journal. Forget it. So within this big field called linguistics, you carve out a small area of it that will be your territory. It can't be a big territory. It has to be a contained one. I'll give you a sample sentence, not from linguistics, from anything. Most of the literature in the field of X focuses on the relationship between A and B. That's a territory. No bigger than that. Got it? Then when you establish a niche, you say, yet few papers or no papers readers or no scholars have looked at the relationship between B and B plus 1, comma, a relationship that is critical for understanding the processes of the important processes of LMNOP. So now you've said, here's my niche. Here's an area nobody has looked at, and yet it's critical for understanding the important processes of something in the field. So you've told the reader, here's a niche, and it's important for you to know it. In English, you sell your own paper. You have to do public relations for your own paper. Because if you don't say what you're doing is important, what you're doing is new, what you're doing is novel, why should anybody read it? Everybody's busy. They only have time to read so many papers. Now, I work a lot in Scandinavia, and mostly in Denmark, also in Sweden and Norway, and they have something called the Jantelaw. It's kind of ironical and sarcastic, but it's a cultural law that says, and who the hell do you think you are that you think you're better than anybody else? So they dress quietly, they don't wear flashy jewelry, they don't wear much makeup. They would never say, oh, I've published this, or oh, I've published that, or say, yay for me, and here's my big CV, because that would be culturally impolite. So when I say to them, you need to say, this is a novel method for doing X, they say, oh, I can't use the word novel. And I say, yeah, but if you don't, the French and the Germans will, and they'll get published. And in fact, I work in German-speaking Switzerland, and when I taught the word novel, and I come to consult twice a year on PhD papers, every single paper now has the word novel in it because they heard me say that that helps for getting published. And everyone has a novel method, a novel data set, a novel something. They got the message, whereas the Scandinavians culturally are struggling with this. You have to toot your own horn. It's an American expression. If you don't tell the reader that what you're doing is important, how is the reader supposed to know? Never use the word interesting. It is the kiss of death. It is a student word. Oh, an interesting aspect. Remember I told you nobody cares about you? Nobody wants to know what's interesting to you. They want to know what's valuable, important, or necessary, or useful for them in their work. Got it? I cannot reiterate this enough. Forget the word interesting. Forget it. It doesn't exist anymore. You have taken it out of your academic vocabulary, right? Yes? Okay. So now we know how to create a niche. So the niche would be, however few papers have looked at the relationship of B to B plus 1, a relationship that is critical for our understanding of the important processes of blah, blah, blah. Now, occupy the niche. You do this with what is called the purpose statement. This paper or this article, or this study, depending what word they use in the journal. Okay? This paper analyzes the relationship of B to B plus 1 using a data set from such and such and applying the blah, blah, blah theory of such and such. It has to be one sentence. Then you can be more specific. Then you can say more specifically, we look at the questions of this, we ask questions about that, we do this, we do the other. But your purpose statement, you see, it's a misnomer. It's the wrong word. It's called the purpose statement in English, but it's really the framing sentence. It tells the reader in one sentence what the paper is going to do and what the reader can expect to find in it. And you have to do these three things. Establish the territory, establish the niche, and occupy your niche within the first 3 paragraphs of your paper. Your purpose statement may come at the beginning of the 4th paragraph, I think that's a little bit late. It depends how much background you need to establish about the territory or about the niche. But I've seen European papers, Russian papers, European papers, where they go on for 3 pages, and the top of page 4 they say what the paper's going to do. Forget it, the reader will have gone into mega reading and put the paper down long before that. Long before that. One of the things, I'm just thinking about it now, so I'm going to say it and then we'll take a break, because I think break time is coming up, isn't it? Or is it, do I have another half hour? How much more time do I have before the break?
Well, 10 minutes, because now it's 11:30, but we started later than 10.
Oh, okay.
So 10 minutes?
10 minutes? Okay. So,
pardon? It should be 12.
Well, it's coming up.
Will you be
so
okay?
10
Will you make
minutes.
it? I mean,
10 minutes, 15 minutes,
15
fine.
minutes, yes.
Okay. So now what was I going to say? my mind is jumping to too many places at once. What you see when you have this, establish the territory, establish the niche, occupy the niche, you see the same movement in English from the most general to the less general to the more specific. And this is how we write. Every section, every paper, every paragraph goes from the most general to the more and more and more specific. New paragraph from slightly less general to more and more specific. Next paragraph, from slightly less general to the more and more specific, but always moving down with no room for digression. Everything is where it needs to be. And what I find with the Russian scholars is difficulty in figuring out where things need to be. Now, one of the problems I discovered working with the Russian scholars is that, and I'd like to see a show of hands on this, just out of curiosity, is that when they wrote papers and they wanted to get published in English, they would write it in Russian, and then they would send it out for translation. So I have a translation service, do it in English. Have any of you done that? Anybody, or have you not written papers yet? They're all writing in English here. Yes.
They don't translate.
Okay, good.
They think in English.
Good. Because if you write in Russian, you're thinking in Russian, and you're organizing according to Russian paradigms, and the translator will translate it into English according to Russian paradigms, and it will be useless in English. Even though the translation may be accurate, it will be useless. So it's really, really important to think in English. One of the best writers from this course we had in November happened to be in the States in January for a conference, and so she called me and we talked for a while. And this is also cultural. I told her she was one of the best writers, and she immediately said, "Oh, I don't think I can take that compliment. It's too much." And I said, no, it's not a compliment. We have so many papers, people have different levels of writing, and your level of writing is in the upper tier of the group. There's always some people who write better than others, and yours happens to be better. This is an objective assessment, not a compliment. Can you accept it? She said, okay. And she said to me, she's a professor at Guimau, and she said, I always write in English, but it's embarrassing. She said, it takes me about an hour a paragraph to write in English. And I said, I believe you, but the work shows because you're one of the 2 top writers in the class. I can read yours. It's easy to edit. What I can't edit are the ones that are written in such strange, abstract, theoretical language that with weird vocabulary choices that I have no clue what the person is saying at all. English demands huge precision of language, and what I'm finding is that in Russian there are a number of words that have a great many meanings. So there's a word that could mean necessary and it could mean important. Well, in English, necessary and important are two totally different words. We use them totally differently. You have to know which one. Another word is, I forget the Russian word, but it could mean problem or it could mean challenge. Well, problem and challenge we use totally differently. You have to know the word. So English demands this just total precision. And that's why not all of the journals, I would say 75% of the journals I have looked at tell their readers, guidelines for submission guidelines, tell their prospective contributors, have your paper edited by a native speaker of English. And if you don't know any, we can recommend some services. You will have to pay for them. We cannot tell you how good they are, but at least here are some places you can go to find an editor. In English, because every word is so important, we edit our own papers 10 and 12 times before we ever send them out, and that's in our first language. We'll do the research, we'll do the work, we'll do whatever it is, then we'll show it to a professor, we'll show it to some colleagues, they'll make some comments. Then people in Europe will go to conferences, they read the paper at the conferences, they get feedback. Gee, this would really be better if you brought in data from here. Have you read so-and-so? What about adding, don't just divide them by gender, but why don't you also divide them by region or by social class or by this or by that, and so on and so forth. And then they go back and they write it again, and they write it again. In the organizations, I consult for universities, I consult for research institutes. People will come to me and have me edit the paper before they go to the conference. And they say, don't worry about it too much because it's going to change after I get the feedback, but I want the language to be clear so that everybody understands me at this international conference. And then they come back, they get the comments, and they write it again, and then they bring it back for a final editing with the journal analysis and everything else. So but we edit ourselves that much. So it's always good to find an editor, but you've got to find a native speaker. You've got to find native speakers. There are places to go, and I can give you some resources for that. But you have to pay for it. But you need somebody who can absolutely work with every single word. Because some people say, well, once the paper is reviewed, they're going to make changes on it anyway, and the reviewers will ask for changes, so why should the paper be that well written when I send it in? The answer is, if it's badly written, it won't be sent out for review if it's that bad. So you have to put your best foot forward going in, and then you have to, if you get lucky enough to get what's called a revise and resubmit, please revise it according to the editor's comments and resubmit the paper. You have to go and get someone to edit it again before you resubmit it. It's a long process. And what I'm happy about is that, let's say, over the last, let's say in a 6-year period, I'm averaging 10 to 12 published papers a year for the people I work with. And that's including the 1.5 to 2-year process from when I first see it to when it goes to a conference, to when it comes back, to when it gets submitted. Do they have to wait for the reviewer to come back? They have to do more research. They have to rewrite it. So if you're figuring at least 12 papers a year, that's not bad. And some people's careers have been made as a result of this, and they're being published again and again and again and again. And they won't send out any paper until I've looked at it, because they know. And if not me, then someone else. But the idea is we send out our own papers in English for editing because we want our paper to be the best. When I wrote this book, I teach writing. but we're all too close to our own material. I sent it out to 5 different people, 2 native speakers and 3 Europeans, and solicited feedback to make sure I did everything absolutely right. We would never publish in our own language without having it edited. That's because of the demands in English that every word be perfect, and that the reader cannot for an instant misunderstand anything. Okay, is this helpful? So I think it's probably, given what I have to do, it's probably a good time for a break. If I say 15 minutes, is that enough? And will you all be back in 15 minutes? Because I'm going to start. Because I want to make sure I have enough time both to do the rest of what I want to do and open it up for questions.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask. Maybe there are some spontaneous questions.
Oh, does anyone have any
maybe
questions at this point? At this point, any questions? Anybody? You can ask anything.
Right, then...
Okay, then we'll wait till the end. Let's go take a break.